All right. So today on day two in our unit on ecology, what we're going to be talking about is ecological relationships, feeding relationships, and how energy flows. So these right here would mainly be things that would deal with density dependent factors. That's really what day two is about, or the density dependent factors that exist inside of an ecosystem. Okay. So, whenever we first know about organisms, we need to know about their niche or niche. I've heard it pronounced either way. Typically, I go more niche than niche. But anyway, what this means is what a niche is it's the role that that organism plays. So we have different types of roles. We have producers. We have the role of a consumer, decomposer, and even scavenger. And there's also other little sub roles that exist inside of this as well. And we're not going to go through every single little one of them because we'd probably be here all day. The thing to know about producers make their own food. We already talked about that earlier this year about how about that being through the process of photosynthesis. And what we would call these organisms are autotrophs. And that'll be very important coming up here later on in today's lesson. Consumers would be anything that eats something else. That could either be a herbivore eating a producer, or that could be an apex predator carnivore that is eating that herbivore. And of course, like I just said, I just gave some of the different terms there. Like a herbivore would be a plant eater, an omnivore would be an organism that eats plants and animals. Or you also have a carnivore, and a carnivore would eat only animals. And an apex predator is a carnivore that is at the top of its food chain. Okay. And I do have terms like primary, secondary, and tertiary. Tertiary meaning the third consumer. And it really, you could have more than that. Um, but those are just some of the more common ones that we will use in this class. Decomposer. These are organisms that break down dead organisms to get nutrients. Fungi, great example, and bacteria is a phenomenal example of decomposers. Scavengers are animals that consume dead organisms that have died from causes by other organisms, or just through some type of injury or whatever it might be, or even old age, and they just die. Scavengers do that, so don't get confused a scavenger with a decomposer because they aren't the same thing. Okay. Whenever we talk about symbiosis, what we're talking about is the relationships that exist between organisms, and so we have three main types that we're going to look at: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. For mutualism, this is whenever both organisms will benefit. So some of the examples I give you here are like bees and flowers. Both organisms benefit. Whenever a bee goes to a flower, a bee gets the nectar to be able to take that back, which will be food for the winter time, and basically it'll be what helps the beehive survive. Flowers, in turn, they get pollinated. As the bees get that nectar, the pollen will actually stick to the coats of the bees, and then as they go from flower to flower, they drop off that pollen, which actually helps the flower population or that organism grow and thrive. We have the clownfish and sea anemone. We have the tick birds and rhinos. Now, there has been some new information that I found on different types of tick birds and rhinos, are really large herbivores in general. I've seen some information that talks about how that could also, in some aspects, be considered almost like a parasitic relationship, because a lot of times what the tick birds might do is they might cause a wound on a rhino to stay open and not heal because they'll constantly pick at it, because that will cause more ticks and other parasites to grow, to survive, or to go or be drawn to that wound. Um, so I've really seen it both ways. I want to leave it here under mutualism because most of the things I see describe it more as a mutualistic relationship, and they don't really concentrate on it. So just Typically, but that's the reason why what I want to do here is in this section, I like to focus on the actual meaning of it so that whenever you're given an example and you read that example, you're able to figure out are both organisms benefiting from this relationship, or is only one benefiting, or is one of them being harmed? That way, it would help you out there. We also have the crocodile and the plover. Y'all have probably heard of it as the crocodile bird. Basically, what the crocodile does here is the crocodile will sit there with its mouth open, and then that bird will go inside the crocodile's mouth and it'll eat leeches off of its gums. It'll pick out bits of dead things out of its teeth. So it's basically like its dentist. Wouldn't y'all have liked to have been that first bird that said, you know what? I think I'm going to go in there and have lunch. And then being all the other birds that are sitting there watching that bird do that and saying, you're crazy. But anyway, it was an adaptation, it was a relationship that they developed. And so that's what they do. And so those are examples of how organisms their relationship is together, and they benefit from the relationship together. Commensalism is whenever one organism will benefit and the other one could care less. Great example of this is like the sharks and the remora fish. Basically, what happens is the remora fish will even sometimes hitch a ride on the sharks, and whenever the sharks eat, whatever it is that they happen to get and eat in bits that fall, the remora fish are able to clean up after them. You also have what's known as the cattle and the egrets. And I put cattle here because really it can be any large herbivore. I just know that I've seen a lot with cows just from me growing up and seeing egrets that'll follow them around. Basically, if you've ever walked through high grass before, you'll notice that as you walk, bugs will start hopping around because you're knocking around basically where they're hanging out at, things like that. Well, egrets will follow the cattle, and they'll just walk behind them. And as they walk behind them, they'll just eat the bugs that are jumping because they're stirring up the bugs for them. The cattle's in no way benefit from this relationship, but because the egrets are following them, the egrets get an easy meal. So that's the reason why that's a good example of a commensalistic relationship. Another good one is the dung beetle. So basically, a large herbivore will poop. Whenever that large herbivore poops, that large herbivore is no longer worried about its poop. The dung beetle will come around and say, wow, that looks like some delicious looking doo doo. I want to take that home with me and I'm going to lay my eggs in it. I'm going to build my house out of it, build my little nest out of it, and I'm even going to eat on it. And because that's what I do, I'm a dung beetle and I like doo doo. That's a commensalistic relationship, and a nasty one at that. And the last one is parasitic relationship. This is probably one of the easiest ones for students to get correct because you always have one organism that is being harmed, such as ticks, fleas, mosquitoes, tapeworms, and intestinal bacteria of some type that is causing you to be sick. Boom. That is you being harmed. Now, I'm going to explain to you what the brown headed cowbird does real quick. The brown headed cowbird is kind of a jerk. So basically, what the brown headed cowbird will do is that it will go and it will lay its eggs inside of another bird's nest whenever that bird is off doing whatever. And whenever that bird is in there and it hatches, those little chicks will toss out the other bird's eggs that were there, and then that bird will care for and tend to the brown-headed cowbird's chicks instead. That is a parasitic relationship because that's actually hurting the species of the other bird. And it's really messed up too, if you think about that. It really is messed up. So those are the different relationships, and I give you a lot of examples here. But basically, what I'm going to do, I rarely ask you about just the definition of them. What I tend to do on my questions is I give you an example, and I kind of describe the relationships of two organisms and tell you how they interact with each other. And then from there, you have to decide what type of relationship it is, whether it be mutualism, commensalism, or parasitism. In the quizzes on this unit, I also have a lot of these type of questions, so it really will help you out moving forward. Okay. All right. So here's some other types of relationships that exist. Common one: predator prey. Most people could pick this one out easy. Basically, predator hunts, captures, and feeds on the animal that will be its prey. Herbivores are not predators. I had an issue with this last year. Just because herbivores are consumers, it does not make them predators. They do not have to sneak up on, you know, a big hyping pile of grass to go eat it. That would be odd if you saw a cow sneaking up on grass or hay to eat. No. Predators would be consumers that would be carnivores, or an omnivore that is operating on its, and it's eating another animal in that sense. Competition is the struggle between any two organisms for the same resource. So competition can be within the same species, or it could be with different species. A great example of this that I think of is I just was watching a video the other day. I was watching one of the Planet Earth videos, and these wolves have been hunting down this caribou, and they finally got it down. Blah blah blah, and they're eating. Well, they come back the next day, and the next thing you know, there's a big grizzly bear on it. And so they have to decide if they want to fight for this or not, because they know that grizzly bear is going to put up a fight, and that grizzly bear has to decide the same thing: do I want to fight for this carcass? And they do a little bit, and the grizzly bear ends up keeping the carcass, because the wolves decide it's just not worth it. They can go get some more food somewhere else. That would be competition between two different species for food. Another type of competition, I talked about it earlier with competition for a mate. Basically, the alpha wolf is the one um, that gets mating privileges with the females, and then every now and then, one of the younger wolves will put up a fight, and whoever's the top wolf is the alpha wolf in that sense, and that would be competition for mating. And of course, you could have competition for food, water, even shelter, and light. That would be, a lot of people kind of get confused by what do you mean by competition for light. Well, if you think about plants are constantly competing for light. They're constantly trying to grow in whatever way they can toward light, territory, and then, of course, mating being the last one on that list. So what I'll do here is basically you would have examples of organisms competing, and you would have to know that that is a competition. Remember to make sure you can tell the difference between competition and predator prey. Competition is between two organisms for the same resource. Predator prey is whenever basically you have one organism and the prey is the resource that it's going against. So make sure you can differentiate between those two. And the next type is cooperation. Some organisms do cooperate with one another, a relationship in which members of the same species work together to ensure survival. So don't think of cooperation and mutualism as being the same thing. Mutualism is different species. Cooperation is the same species, where they work together. Such as wolves, they hunt in a pack, but they also live in a pack, and that all helps them create, for their survival. Lions have a pride, and that of course helps with their survival as well. Even herds of herbivores, that's actually beneficial to their survival. Because if they're a single herbivore out there alone, they're easy to get picked off by single predators. And the last one we're going to look at is mimicry. Mimicry is not camouflage. Remember, camouflage, and so I do have a lot of these examples of what camouflage is on your quiz is, just to make sure you do know the difference. Camouflage is wanting to blend in with your environment so that you can become kind of invisible or whatever. Mimicry might be a method that you use to help you blend in. So one type of mimicry would be for protection would be like the ability to blend in, like to copy what something else looks like. I think a lot of times of insects that kind of look like leaves. That kind of reminds me of what that type of mimicry is. You have another type of mimicry where organisms will copy another organism as a warning sign. So a good one would be like the coral snake. The coral snake, that whole red touch black friend of Jack kind of deal. And then you also have other snakes that and then red touch yellow kill a fellow. You have snakes that copy each other, like a venomous snake will copy a non venomous snake will copy a venomous snake to make other organisms think that they're venomous and you want to stay away from them. Another good one is how they'll copy it'd be like a warning sign to let things know, hey, I don't blend in at all. I'm standing way out and I'm letting you know if you get near me, it's going to be bad for you. I think of the poisonous dart frogs that are really pretty, but they're poisonous, obviously. So those would be two great examples of how you could use it for protection and as a warning to animals, and they get to decide. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a food chain. So food chains are quite easy here, and basically what I'm going to do and I'm going to ask you to do here is be able to label the parts of the food chain, whether it is a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, or in this case I have a tertiary consumer that would be the apex predator, the owl. And then of course we have decomposers there. I would give you this right here and you would basically be able to label it. This is where most students make a mistake at. Most students make the mistake is if I ask them for the secondary consumer, they will tell me that the grasshopper is the secondary consumer because it's the second one on the list. Remember, secondary consumer means it's the second consumer. Grass is a producer. The grasshopper would be the first consumer. The secondary consumer would be the blue jay that would be eating the grasshopper. And please don't forget that, sorry about that, the ultimate source of energy here in this food chain would be the sun. It is providing the energy for this ecosystem. All right. And so here's an example of the types of questions that you would have. What do the arrows represent following this food chain? Each one of these arrows, actually what they represent is the flow of energy. Most students will mistake and think that it's talking about what eats what, but grass does not eat grasshoppers, and grasshoppers do not eat frogs, and frogs do not eat snakes. Okay? What it's talking about is it's talking about how that when the grasshopper eats the grass, that energy that's within the grass will flow into the grasshopper, and that grasshopper can use that food as energy for its own purposes. Which organisms would be described as the secondary consumer? That would be the frog would be described as the secondary consumer. Which organism is the apex predator? That would be the eagle. Which organism is the autotroph? The autotroph, auto means making its own food, making its own energy. That would be the grass. Which organism is the primary consumer? That would be the grasshopper. And where does the grass get its energy from? Grass gets its energy from the sun. Okay? And then we're going to look at food webs. All a food web is a bunch of food chains that are interconnected. A food web is a better diagram to actually describe how organisms exist inside of an ecosystem. So other than doing what we just did on answering those type of questions, you'll also need to be able to predict changes that will happen, and which could be due to human impact or through abiotic factors, or maybe even some biotic factors on how that would change the feeding relationship. So I give you an example here, and I ask you some questions off of it. I ask you about the different types of producers. Can you label the consumers, the primary consumers? Remember, primary consumers would be all the ones that only are eating the producers. Ask you about the secondary, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, has been able to use some of those terms. And what do the arrows represent? So, some other types of questions that I would ask from this is how would let's say if a farmer used an insecticide on its plants, on its garden, which killed off the grasshoppers in this image, how would that impact the squirrel population? So if you took a second to think about that, you might think some people might say, "Oh, well, it wouldn't affect the squirrel population because they're not connected to each other." But if you notice, the grasshopper eats some of the food that the squirrel eats, but that just means that there would be more food for the squirrel and the rabbit, so that would probably increase uh, the population for the squirrel. Okay. But if I asked you how would that impact the frog population? Well, since the frogs in this picture only eats the grasshopper, well, that means that the frog population would decrease because there's no more food for the frog to eat. Those are some of those impact questions that I'm talking about. Is if I give you a scenario to where one organism either decreases or increases, I might ask you how would that affect other organisms and impact their lives. And this is some of those examples right there of those types of questions. Um, and so make sure that you're able to answer these and be able to make those predictions accurately. These are typically questions that are a little bit more wordy, and so are their answers are more wordy, but they're still pretty easy to get correct. So whenever you see these questions, I know a lot of times we have the tendency to just, oh, I don't want to feel like answering them because it's just a lot of reading. Go ahead and read it. All it's going to do is just describe organisms that interact with each other, and then from there, you just have to use your common sense on narrowing down your answer choices. Okay, but you'll definitely be able to do it once we go through this together. All right. And the last one is the energy pyramid and how that works. So basically, what we have is the 10% rule, such as producers receive their energy from the sun. That means that they get to keep 90% of everything that they have, and they're going to use it for their own growth and purposes. 10% after they're eaten, 10% of the energy that they had will actually move on to the next level. And that means, and then 10% will move on to the next level. And that's why the pyramid actually gets smaller at each level. Now, if you notice on the picture on the left, I have down 10 producers, 10,000 KCAL. That actually means kilocalories. So what we're talking about there is energy. That's what that's talking about is energy. Sometimes you might also see it as joules, but either way, it's energy. And what we should see is we should see it going down at each level, and it should make kind of like a pyramid type shape typically. And that's our 10% rule. All right, so that is it for day 2. Make sure that you do your quizzes, assignments, and email me or ask me in class if you have any questions.